What if everything you thought faith was already dead?
What if almost everyone has been reading it backwards? Because the truth hidden inside the book of James was never meant to comfort you, but to wake you up.
Because what I'm about to tell you isn't preached from pulpits. It isn't debated in classrooms. And it certainly isn't explained in neat verses. But if you stay with me until the end, you'll begin to see why this short, overlooked letter may be one of the most dangerous, disruptive, and reality-shattering texts ever written. A message that sounds less like religion and more like a warning transmitted across time to anyone willing to listen while they're still alive. It begins quietly, almost deceptively, with a man who introduces himself not as a brother of Jesus, not as a leader, not as a visionary, but simply as a servant. And that choice alone should unsettle you, because servants see what kings never notice. And James is writing from a place most people never reach, a place where belief is no longer theoretical, where suffering has stripped away illusions, and where faith has collided head-on with reality itself. And here's where the story takes a turn most people miss, because James doesn't write like someone trying to persuade you to believe something new. He writes like someone who assumes you already believe, and now he wants to know whether that belief is alive or already dead. Near-death survivors often describe a moment when everything they thought mattered suddenly dissolves, when titles, words, intentions, even identities fall away, and all that remains is what they actually became, not what they claimed to be. And James speaks from that same edge, that same threshold between worlds, where faith is no longer measured by what you say, but by what you've embodied when no one was watching. And this is where most people stop listening. But the truth goes deeper, because James isn't attacking doubt. He's attacking self-deception, the most lethal condition of the soul, the kind that convinces you you're safe when you're actually asleep. He speaks of trials not as punishments, but as instruments, pressure chambers designed to reveal what's really inside you. And modern neuroscience tells us the same thing in different language, that stress doesn't create character. It exposes it, that when the brain is pushed to its limits, the masks fall, and what remains is the true architecture of the self. And James seems to know this long before brain scans or psychology, because he writes as if suffering is a kind of X-ray, a filter through which false faith cannot pass, a fire that consumes words but leaves only action behind. What follows may change how you understand life itself, because James introduces a terrifying possibility, that faith can exist in name only, that belief can survive without breath, without motion, without love, like a body preserved but no longer alive. Near-death accounts often describe observing their own lifeless form, realizing too late that something essential had departed, and James uses the same language, the same imagery, warning that faith without works is dead, not weak, not incomplete, but dead, and dead things do not respond when called. And then, almost without warning, James turns his attention to the tongue, to speech, to the smallest instrument capable of the greatest destruction. And suddenly, this ancient letter feels uncomfortably modern, because science now tells us that language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it, that words rewire the brain, influence behavior, and alter the emotional state of both speaker and listener. James knew this intuitively, describing the tongue as fire, as poison, as a force capable of setting entire worlds ablaze. And when near-death experiencers return, many of them report the same realization, that every word spoken carried weight, consequence, vibration, far beyond what they ever imagined while alive. But the letter doesn't slow down, and neither does the warning, because James moves from speech to desire, from desire to conflict, from conflict to systems of power, wealth, and injustice. And here, the story grows darker, because James isn't speaking abstractly. He's describing a world out of balance, where people pray for blessings while exploiting others, where spirituality becomes a costume worn over unchecked hunger. And he asks a question that still echoes today. How can you claim intimacy with the divine while feeding on the suffering of those around you? This is where myth and mystery begin to bleed into theology, because ancient traditions across cultures speak of judgment not as punishment imposed from above, but as exposure. A moment when the hidden structure of the soul is revealed in full light, and James writes as if that moment is already approaching, as if time itself is compressing, urging his readers to live now, as though the veil could lift at any second. Some physicists suggest time may not be linear, that all moments coexist, and James seems to operate from that same awareness, speaking as though the future is already watching the present, weighing it, remembering it. And just when you think the message can't become more unsettling, James introduces patience, not as passive waiting, but as active endurance, the kind forged only through pain, the kind near-death survivors describe when they speak of being held at the edge, suspended between worlds, unable to move forward or back, forced to confront themselves without distraction. James' patience is not soft. It is sharp, disciplined, forged in suffering, and he compares it to a farmer waiting for rain, not idle, but alert, aware that the season will come whether he's ready or not. The letter moves faster now, like a current pulling you toward something unspoken, warning against arrogance, against presuming tomorrow belongs to you, because James understands something most of us avoid, that life is fragile, brief, vapor-like, here and gone before the mind can fully grasp it. Near-death experiencers often say the same thing, that life felt impossibly short once seen from the outside, that every wasted moment suddenly carried unbearable weight. And James writes with that urgency, as if every sentence is a final chance to course correct. Then comes the image that refuses to leave you, the sick person, the suffering one, surrounded not by spectators, but by community. Prayer not as ritual, but as intervention. Confession not as shame, but as release. Modern studies on healing show the body responds profoundly to belief, connection, and intention. And James presents healing as a convergence point, where inner alignment meets outer reality, where isolation breaks, and something long dormant begins to move again. And yet, even here, James refuses to offer closure, because the final warning lingers like an unfinished chord, that to turn someone back from the wrong path is to save a soul from death. And the word death here is heavier than it appears, layered, multifaceted, echoing not just physical ending, but existential collapse, the loss of becoming what you were meant to be. And just as you think the letter is about to end, it opens something far more unsettling, because it implies that salvation is not a single moment, not a declaration, but a continuous trajectory, a living motion that can still be interrupted, diverted, or restored. And this is where the silence grows loud, because if James is right, then the most dangerous place isn't doubt, or disbelief, or even rebellion, but comfort, the quiet assumption that nothing more is required, that the journey is already complete. Near-death survivors often say the most shocking realization wasn't fear, but regret, not for what they suffered, but for what they failed to do while they still had time. And James writes like someone who has seen that regret up close, who knows how close the line really is, who understands that belief alone doesn't cross it. And just as the tension reaches its breaking point, just as you begin to sense that James isn't writing to ancient believers at all, but directly to you right now, in this moment, the letter seems to lean forward, as if about to reveal the final, most unsettling truth, that everything you've heard so far is only the surface, that the real test of faith hasn't even begun yet, because what comes next isn't about what you believe or what you say, or even what you do when others are watching, but about what remains when the world strips you bare, when suffering presses in, when time runs out. And the question that hangs unresolved in the air is not whether you believed, but whether your faith was ever truly alive. The next truth is something very few are prepared to hear, because James doesn't measure faith at its beginning. He measures it at its breaking point, at the exact moment when obedience costs you something real, something irreversible, something you cannot take back. He writes as though he's already watched people fail this test, watched belief collapse under pressure, watched confident words evaporate the instant survival, comfort, or reputation was threatened. And this is where fear and wonder collide, because James implies that faith is not proven in moments of clarity, but in moments of contradiction. When the world tells you one thing, your instincts scream another, and obedience feels like stepping into darkness without knowing whether the ground will appear beneath your feet. Near-death experiencers often describe a point where they were shown moments they thought were insignificant, choices they barely remembered, words they dismissed as harmless. And James seems to write with that same perspective, as if time has already folded back on itself, as if the consequences of ordinary decisions have already been revealed to him in full. He speaks as though nothing is neutral, as though every action is either forming something alive or accelerating decay. And this idea alone is deeply unsettling, because it suggests there is no spiritual autopilot, no safe middle ground where intention excuses inaction. What happens next is rarely spoken about, because James begins to dismantle the illusion that morality is private. He writes as if the unseen realm is listening, watching patterns, weighing trajectories, rather than isolated events. Modern physics whispers something similar, proposing that observation alters reality, that systems behave differently when they are seen. And James writes as if the soul itself is under constant observation, not for condemnation, but for revelation. And suddenly the text feels less like ancient advice and more like a transcript from a higher vantage point, a place where excuses cannot survive, because everything is seen whole. He turns again to desire, but this time more sharply, describing how craving, when left unchecked, gives birth to destruction. And this isn't metaphorical, it's biological, neurological, spiritual. Neuroscience shows how repeated desire rewires the brain, narrowing perception, weakening restraint, making future resistance harder, not easier. James writes as if he knows this chain reaction intimately, warning that what begins as a thought eventually demands embodiment, and once embodied, it no longer obeys the mind that invited in. Near-death survivors often say they felt the weight of patterns, not just actions, as if habits themselves had mass, and James' language mirrors this chilling idea. And then the letter shifts again, almost imperceptibly, toward humility, but not the kind celebrated in speeches or social media captions. James' humility is violent to the ego. It demands submission, surrender, the deliberate lowering of the self so that something truer can rise. He writes as if pride is not merely a character flaw, but a form of spiritual blindness, a condition that makes people unreachable even by God. Studies on cognitive bias confirm this in secular terms, that certainty hardens perception, that the most confident minds are often the least correct, and James presents humility as the only doorway through which wisdom can enter. This is where the atmosphere grows heavier. Because James suggests that resistance to this humility isn't neutral either, it's hostility. He describes friendship with the world as enmity with God, language so stark it feels almost unfair, until you realize he's not talking about enjoying life, but about aligning yourself with systems built on exploitation, deception, and self-exaltation. Near-death accounts often include descriptions of environments that felt hollow, empty, glittering but lifeless. And James writes as if the world itself can become such a place, seductive, impressive, and ultimately incapable of sustaining the soul. The next movement in the letter feels like standing at the edge of something irreversible. James warns against judging others, not because judgment is unkind, but because it reveals a fatal misunderstanding of one's own position. He writes as though the law itself is alive, whole, indivisible, and to break it at any point is to fracture the entire structure. This echoes ancient mythological ideas of cosmic order, where harmony is not maintained by perfection, but by alignment, and once alignment is lost, collapse follows quickly. Near-death survivors often say they felt an overwhelming sense of coherence on the other side, a unity so complete that even small distortions felt unbearable. And just when the tension threatens to overwhelm, James introduces mercy, not as softness, but as power, as the only force capable of interrupting the cycle. He writes that mercy triumphs over judgment, a phrase that feels almost defiant, as if mercy itself is a higher law, one that overrides the machinery of consequence without denying it. Modern psychology hints at this too, showing how forgiveness can rewire trauma, reduce stress responses, and restore fractured identities. And James writes as if mercy is not only relational, but ontological, something that alters the structure of reality itself. But the letter refuses to let you rest there, because immediately James turns toward wealth, toward hoarded abundance, toward comfort built on the backs of unseen labor, and the tone becomes almost apocalyptic. He speaks as though wealth itself can testify, can cry out, can accuse. This mirrors ancient myths where objects carried memory, where injustice left residue, and even modern science acknowledges something similar in a different language, that systems remember, that inequality compounds, that exploitation leaves traces long after the initial act. Near-death experiencers often describe being confronted not by a judge, but by truth itself, unavoidable, self-evident, and James writes as if wealth, misused, becomes a witness against its owner. The intensity tightens further as James reminds his readers that suffering cries out, that ignored pain accumulates, that delayed justice does not disappear. He writes as if the universe itself leans toward restoration, toward reckoning, toward balance, and those who resist this movement place themselves directly in its path. Some physicists describe entropy as inevitable, the universe's relentless drive toward equilibrium, and James seems to echo this principle spiritually, warning that resistance only increases the force of the correction when it finally arrives. And then, almost cruelly, James returns to patience again, but now it feels different, heavier, as if patience is no longer an encouragement, but a final endurance test. He speaks of endurance in suffering as something that aligns a person with the prophets, with those who spoke truth, knowing it would cost them everything. Near-death accounts often mention a sense of calling, of unfinished work, of tasks abandoned too soon. And James writes as if endurance is the difference between becoming part of the story or being remembered only as someone who almost was. The words begin to feel less like instruction and more like pressure, like a narrowing corridor, because James strips away every remaining escape route, no swearing by heaven or earth, no clever language to soften commitment, no ambiguity. Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. Modern neuroscience confirms how cognitive dissonance fractures the psyche, how divided selves suffer more deeply, and James seems to know this, demanding integration, wholeness, alignment between inner reality and outer action. And just as the air grows thin, just as the implications become almost unbearable, James circles back to community, to confession, to mutual restoration, suggesting that isolation is one of the most dangerous illusions of all. Near-death survivors often say they felt interconnected to everyone they had ever known. That separation was the greatest lie they had believed while alive. And James writes as if community is not optional, but essential infrastructure for survival. And then, quietly, almost too quietly, the letter hints again at death, not as an ending, but as a divergence point, a place where trajectories finalize, where paths either converge toward life or collapse inward. And the most unsettling realization begins to form, one James never states outright, but leaves suspended in the tension, that faith, as he understands it, is not a possession you hold, but a direction you travel, and at any moment, without warning, that direction can be tested, exposed, or overturned, because what lies ahead, what James seems to be preparing his readers for, is not a moment of belief, but a moment of unveiling, when everything hidden is brought into light, and the only thing that will matter is not what you claimed or intended, or hope to become, but what you have already been shaped into, because the next revelation presses closer still. And it has to do with what happens when prayer no longer feels safe, when suffering no longer feels temporary, and when the silence you face is not empty at all, but filled with something waiting to respond. And now, as everything you've heard begins to echo together, the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore, because this journey through the book of James was never about information. It was about exposure. From the first unsettling question to the final lingering silence, everything has been pointing to one unavoidable truth. Faith is not something you claim, it is something you become. We walked through trials that were never punishments, but mirrors, through words that carried the power to create or destroy worlds, through desires that quietly shaped destinies, through humility that dismantled the ego, through mercy that rewrote judgment, through suffering that cried out even when ignored, through patience that separated those who endure from those who almost did. James has been whispering and sometimes shouting that life is not a rehearsal, that belief without embodiment is a hollow shell, that comfort can be more dangerous than doubt, and that the soul is always moving in a direction, whether we admit it or not. What this letter reveals, when you step back and see it whole, is that God is not looking for polished language or public spirituality, but for living faith that breathes through action, endurance, mercy, and love. It tells us that trials are not interruptions to purpose, but the very forge that reveals it, that prayer is not a performance, but a lifeline, that community is not optional, but essential, and that turning even one soul back from destruction matters more than we will ever understand while time still surrounds us. James doesn't leave us with comfort. He leaves us with responsibility, with the sobering realization that every day is shaping something eternal, that every response to suffering, every act of mercy, every choice to endure or retreat is forming the reality we will one day face without disguise. And this is where the message stops being ancient and becomes painfully personal, because this isn't just James speaking anymore. It's God inviting you to look honestly at your own life, your own faith, your own direction. Not with fear, but with courage. Not with shame, but with truth. Because living faith is still alive. Restoration is still possible. Purpose is still unfolding. And the time to respond is not later. It is now. So I want to invite you, urge you, with a sense of holy responsibility. Write your personal confession in the comments. Not for performance, not for approval, but as an act of honesty before God. Share a short prayer, even if it's broken, even if it's just a sentence. Testify about what God has already done in your life, even if the story feels unfinished, because testimony is not about perfection, it's about truth. And if this message stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with at least 10 people or more. Not to grow a channel, not to promote content, but to spread God's word. Because every share places this message in front of another soul who may be standing at the same edge you once stood on. Every share extends God's blessing further than you can see. Every share has the potential to interrupt despair, awaken faith, and redirect a life. This is not entertainment. This is a call. And the question James leaves us with still hangs in the air, waiting for an answer not spoken with words, but with lives lived in response.